Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining FSMA Friday for April 2020 with continuing coverage of the COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Aaron Bolshaw. I'm the VP of Marketing for Safety Chain and today's moderator. So just off the top, wanted to make sure if anyone's new, we've definitely seen a few more people in our fold. FSMA Fridays is ongoing monthly industry updates for food and beverage facility operations, QA, safety and compliance professionals, and Safety Chain partners with the Acheson Group to bring you timely information about the regulatory industry and best practices. So off the top, we're still seeing some technical difficulties stemming from the webinar platform, coping with all the folks that are working from home. Many of you are probably joining us from your couch or dining room, and so we welcome you. But first, I just want to make sure everyone understands the link that you see in the welcome message in the webinar console panel that you have is for last month's webinar, not today's. We did not pre-record this, so we are live right now. So everyone is on mute, but we do want to hear from you. So don't hold back. Start asking questions now if you want, but we'll get to those at the end. And then if you do have any audio issues, the best thing to do is to try and use the call-in number to get to the audio if you're not hearing anything. So yeah, we're going to be covering continuing coverage of COVID-19, but I want to welcome Dr. David Acheson and Dr. Ben Miller of the Acheson Group. Gentlemen, welcome back, and thanks again for joining FSMA Friday.
Pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, thanks. So it seems like the situation is definitely changing daily. And, if you just read a couple of headlines, you're going to see a couple of things, some trends, right? One, some data suggests that we've reached apex in some areas, but we're seeing some plants close now due to illnesses. David, your approach this whole time, the Acheson Group is, very much there's a phased approach. Why don't you take us through this phased approach? We talked about it last time and where we're at right now.
Well, thank you, Aaron, and really appreciate being part of FSMA Friday again. And Ben Miller, my colleague, and myself are going to spend a little time with you all this afternoon, just going over some of the latest updates. You mentioned a phased approach, and absolutely, it's what we're hearing out of the White House. It's what we're hearing from others in terms of how we manage this. As you've pointed out, for many, they're very much still in the thick of it. We're still managing plant closures and increasing numbers of illnesses and many challenges. So what we're going to talk a little bit about is Ben's going to share some thoughts on how we move mitigation to suppression, some interesting data there. And we don't want to forget, we have to continue with the basics. We're still in many parts of the United States, in the world even, where we have to continue with the basics. So we're going to go through some of those. We're going to talk about the role of testing and some challenges, and again, a little bit into the long term. Everybody's talking about recovery of all sorts, and we've got that is an exciting next step, next phase that we're going to go into. So let's go to the next slide, Aaron. I think every time we talk about COVID-19, the message is rapidly changing situation, and today's conversation is absolutely no different. Things are changing all the time, and the value of some of these monthly updates gives us a chance to share some of those changes. But if you're not plugged into our daily update, then do subscribe. It's right there. It's free. You'll get a daily update from TAG. Picking out the key things the food industry needs to know around COVID-19. And speaking of key things, before I hand over to Ben, two late breakers that I think you'll know about or have heard about is the CDC just issued a report in relation to their on-site visit to the Smithfield plant. It's a 15-page report. There's a lot in it. We're going to be doing a digest of that, but the key basics we're going to talk about in this session and what's available through our resources. Essentially, if you're following those things, you'll be meeting most of the things that the CDC are recommending that we do. But we'll be providing a bit more insight into that report in due course early next week. The second late breaker here, Aaron, is EEOC have announced basically what's a green light to testing employees for COVID-19. We're going to talk about testing too in this session, and the value it brings, and some of the pitfalls and things to watch out for. But many have said, is it okay? Am I allowed to test people? Will I get, does it get in the way of HIPAA or American disabilities? And EEOC, as of yesterday, have cleared the runway on that one, and have made it very clear that, yes, you can test your employees for COVID-19 if it's work-related, worker safety-related. But key message that they made and we will make is, quote, ensure that any tests are accurate and reliable. And that's really important, because some are neither accurate nor reliable. So anyway, with that, that's just a bit of late breaker, and I'm going to hand over to Ben to share some interesting data. So Ben, over to you.
Thanks, David. Thanks, everyone. Thought we could start off maybe just with a little kind of check in on the current epidemiology, because I think that helps frame sort of where we are right now in terms of the outbreak and the pandemic. And we'll look at this through somewhat of a US-centric lens for the purpose of this discussion. But I like this graphic. It actually comes from an organization that Tom Frieden, who used to head up the CDC, put together, and there's a link on the bottom of the slide to this playbook, and it's really kind of a policy playbook, but I think it helps us understand where we are and what we need to move from the mitigation phase to more of a suppression phase. So in many parts of the country, we're at this essentially at the top of this peak right now. We're starting to bring through our social and physical distancing activities the outbreak under control, but there's some other things that will need to come into place as we start to head down the other side of the curve and try to move towards something that approximates more normal, not the same normal, but come into a regular rhythm of operations. And so a lot of the conversations that we've been having over the past few weeks really have focused on that. What does that look like? When do we start to return to something that's a little closer to normal than where we are now? And a lot of that will depend, frankly, on some of the testing capabilities that we have at a societal level, and we're not quite there yet. I've got some slides that touch on that, but really, in order to open things back up, and this is consistent too with what the federal government's talking about and some of the guidance that's come out of the White House, is that we need to see a steady decrease in the number of new cases over a sustained period of time, and we need to have testing infrastructure in place in order to be able to test enough people to understand who might be ill. And then in those instances, we need to isolate people that are infected and then trace and quarantine any of their contacts. And it's through those activities that we'll start to be able to move more into the suppression phase and reopen broader segments of the economy overall. Next slide. So this comes from earlier this week or late last week, the article in the New York Times that I think gives a nice graphic in terms of where we are right now in the US as it relates to testing levels. And we're currently testing right about 45 tests per 100,000 people. And that matters. Again, as I said, there's estimates that we need to get up to about 152 tests per 100,000 people in order to more broadly open the economy. We are seeing some states move in the direction of restoring non-essential businesses. Those actions really may be premature based on the level of testing and the level of illness in those jurisdictions. So I think it's going to be something that we're going to collectively watch over the next 3 or 4 weeks to see if there's another wave of illness in those communities, or if things maintain and stay under control. We certainly talked to a lot of companies that have operations in some of those jurisdictions, and talked about the importance of maintaining many of the systems that they have in place, and touch on that in a slide or two in terms of just maintaining the basics, because it helps identify any potential risk to your operation if you're in one of those jurisdictions. Again, why does testing matter? Because, oops, let's jump back to that previous slide. Why does testing matter? Just because we want to be able to effectively isolate anybody that's sick and then trace those contacts. And the goal is really to bring the rate of transmission less than 1. When we do that, then we're going to see a decrease in the number of cases of illness, and we're going to start down the other side of that curve. Currently, right now, and this is based on modeling from the Imperial College in London, and they look at modeling all over the world, country by country, we're right about 1.5 of the rate of transmission. So that means every person that's infected infects about 1.5, 1.6 other people. We need to bring that number below 0, because then we start to see a decrease in the number of new cases. Next slide. So moving again from mitigation to suppression, it's important to remember, a lot of the companies that we work with, have been identified as essential industries and have been running continuously since the beginning of the outbreak. So we've been learning as we go to understand, what are the meaningful interventions that we can put in place in a workplace setting that helps address and minimize risk of transmission in those settings. And those foundational measures, I think, are going to be with us for the long term, certainly for the foreseeable future when we look out, 6, 9, 12 plus months. Again, reopening is going to happen, or hopefully will happen in phases, depending on which jurisdiction you're in. And in the best case scenario, that's going to be data driven. It's going to be driven by a reduction in the number of symptoms that we see, COVID-like symptoms that hospitals and surveillance systems are seeing over a 2-week period, a reduction in the number of actual cases identified over a 2-week period, and ensuring that we have hospital capacity in a particular jurisdiction, so that if there's a loosening of the current stay at home and orders that are in place, that the system's not overwhelmed if they see a surge of cases after reopening. Next slide. So a little bit, there's always right now a logical tension between public health and the economy, although there has been some interesting research that just came out at the end of March that I think it's certainly worth looking at. There's a link to a paper that was done that looks back to the 1918 influenza outbreak. And what that research found was that in 1918 and following 1918, cities that actually implemented and maintained more strict, what they called non-pharmaceutical interventions, which is similar to our stay-at-home orders, actually fared better economically in the long run following the outbreak. And partially the reason for that was that simply having significant mortality in a community just has economic consequences. So the more people that die in a particular area, those aren't people that are able to contribute to the economy in the long run. Sounds a little morbid, but the math and their research really bear that out. But I think it's important to remember that our supply chains and things like that are different 100 years on in 2020 than they were in 1918. So it may not be a perfect correlate, but there's good data to suggest that a more conservative approach from a public health standpoint initially brings greater economic benefit in the long run. Next slide. So why does testing matter so much, and why does just the basic act of screening and understanding who's coming into your facility matter? Well, we do know that there's pre-symptomatic transmission, and this is a paper that was published in CDC's journal, or the CDC's website under the MMWR, and talks about some research that was done in Singapore that looked at what's the time frame of pre-symptomatic transmission. This is just one of the clusters that was investigated. I think they investigated 7 clusters and really looked at a time frame. How long could it take before somebody developed symptoms, but were also infective within that time period? And so when we look at this, we can see that there's a pretty big time range in which a patient was exposed and when they actually became symptomatic. So these two are the source patients, patient A1 and A2. and we look at who they infected later on, and what it tells us is that they were likely infected, several days or more before they actually were presented symptoms themselves. So it becomes important in terms of some of the testing that David's going to talk about later in the presentation, but also just about regular employee screening processes. Next slide. So speaking of those wellness checks, we've seen the symptoms that we look for when trying to screen people change. We started off with fever, cough, and shortness of breath or difficulty breathing, and we've seen that expand both from the CDC into other symptoms to include chills, muscle pain, headache, sore throat. And one that's particularly interesting was the new loss of taste or smell, or anosmia. And we've certainly seen in our own experience that when companies have added those criteria in, and especially the loss of taste or smell, that can be an indicator of that pre-symptomatic illness. I've had a number of anecdotal cases where employees have reported a loss of smell or taste and then gone on to be tested and tested positive, and those were the only symptoms that they ever experienced. So it is a good criteria to include in your screening checklist if you don't have it there already. We're also starting to see that there's evidence that monitoring O2 levels may be beneficial in terms of screening as well, and looking for O2 levels that are less than 90%, and that sometimes early on in the course of illness, it can represent mountain sickness, and so people may not have many of these other symptoms or may not be aware of them, but low oxygen levels can present. Next slide. And this really gets back to just enforcing those basics. So even as we talk about, reopening non-essential businesses or loosening some of the social distancing restrictions that we have in place, understanding that maintaining those is sort of the foundation of your programs within a food processing facility going forward is going to still be very beneficial. So those employee wellness checks, essentially the goal there is to keep people, with any symptoms out. So keep anybody sick out. And then the next layer of that, looking at social distancing, can you rework your operations to keep people physically separated so that if somebody does become sick, you don't have a high number of close contacts? Obviously, we know that certain activities within a food processing facility, that's not something that's easily achieved right now. And so that's where the other elements in this sort of risk mitigation strategy come into play. So making sure that you're continuing to ensure a clean environment through enhanced cleaning and disinfection, and also that your employees are practicing enhanced hygiene right now as well. The other piece that we've certainly seen since I think the last time that we did FSMA Friday is CDC shifting recommendations in terms of mask usage, and then we've certainly seen much more widespread mask usage in food processing facilities now. And so that is used as a barrier, so the wearer is not spreading respiratory droplets. If you get to near universal mask usage in a food facility, it should help reduce the risk of viral spread through that sort of droplet spread. Next slide. So bringing those concepts that we've already seen in place in food manufacturing settings and restaurant settings, those that are still operating right now, to other settings. So as offices reopen, corporate offices reopen, using those same strategies, that same triangle of risk mitigation will be something that's important to consider in other aspects of the economy. So as well as that, continuing to telework. If people don't have to physically be in an office, I think that's always preferred. It's just reducing the number of people that are there that could either transmit the virus before they have symptoms, or you're simply just not there, so that you reduce the risk of anybody else becoming infected. Thinking about returning to work in phases, closing common areas, split shifts, and minimizing non-essential travel, I think are all going to be tools that we'll look at as we reopen certain aspects of business in the near future. And again, continuing those foundational pieces that we talked about. Next slide. Restaurants, when we see restaurants reopen for people to dine in, certainly we'll see seating 6 feet more or apart. Recognizing that mask usage is going to be difficult in those environments, social distancing will be key to ensuring limited transmission in those kind of environments. I think one of the questions, as we see some jurisdictions open up is, will people come back or will they continue to order for pickup or delivery in those settings? So a little bit of when I think about this myself, it's sort of what point do you go back and are comfortable to, sit and have a haircut? That's a different metric for different people, but I think we'll see levels of confidence very much dependent on the amount of testing and the number of new cases that are identified in any jurisdiction. So even if somebody opens back up for business, that business may not pick up until there's a broader public confidence that the outbreak is under control. Also, potentially see customer health screening as well. Certainly not something that we've seen yet in the US. We've got visitor screening the food facility, but this might be something that we also start to see. It's certainly prevalent in other countries around the world. And again, continuing those key foundational pieces. All right, back to you, David. Thanks.
Thank you, Ben. As you can see, there's a lot of science evolving. We're learning a lot about how this disease is spreading and how to stay out in front of it. What I want to do is in the final parts of our conversation today is talk a little bit about testing and some of the ongoing challenges. So let's talk about testing. There is a lot of noise, a lot of questions about testing. Can the private sector do it? Are the health departments going to do it? So we thought it'd be good just to spend a bit of time talking about this. I think with like any test, the first question that you need to think about is what are you going to do with the result? I think probably everybody on this call, or most, are in the food industry, and we all have opinions on the value of testing in food environments and in food itself. And every time we do a test, we should ask that question: well, what am I going to do with the data? What's the result going to tell me? Will it change my action? Will that actually make things worse? So a very important thing to keep in mind as we talk about that. Second point is it really is important to make sure that whatever test you're looking at is accurate. Is it approved by FDA, which in today's environment means that it's emergency use authorized, EUA, from FDA. They do have this expedited process, but we recommend that you look at the details. And if you're not sure what to look at, reach out to us, because the sensitivity and the specificity are really important. You don't want false negatives. You don't want to be relying on a test to screen people out and find, well, oops, the test was wrong. False positives are obviously a problem in their own right, but if you inadvertently hold somebody out by mistake, that's not as bad as letting somebody into the plant who's indeed a true positive. So that sensitivity is really important. There's a lot of numbers thrown around. It's like, oh yeah, it's really accurate, but look at the details. There are basically two kinds of tests that are out there right now. The first is a molecular test. It's using polymerase chain reaction. It's known as RT-PCR. And it's basically looking for the presence of the virus. So it's looking for the nucleic acids of the virus itself, looking for evidence that it's there. The second type of test is an indication that you've had an infection, you've had exposure. So this is really looking at past infection. That's the antibody test. So we've got looking for the virus, and we've got looking at antibody tests. And we'll get on in a couple of slides into how do you manage the challenge of the data that you get. So let's go to the next slide. As we think about challenges broadly, and testing kind of falls into this, is we are seeing, as I'm sure you are, a very, I would say, uneven public health response. There are areas of the U.S. Where you've got local health departments paying a great deal of attention to what's going on in food settings. Obviously, restaurants are pretty much closed. So the big focus, the emphasis has been on restaurants, on manufacturing facilities. Hopefully you can still hear me. My computer just took a dive.
Yeah, we're still live with you. You're good.
Good. All right. Bear with me as I pull up the deck on another computer. That's nothing like technical challenges.
Like we're all seeing these days. Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, as one computer comes up, the other one goes down, and here we go. All right. I'm back. Sorry about that. So as I said, uneven public health responses, and that's just the reality. We see that in food safety. Some states are more forward-leaning than others, but that is just something to be very much aware of. And it's important to do the right thing. Whatever your public health guys are doing, however much they're leaning on you, be looking at how to protect your workers. We've got CDC guidance for essential workers. Ben mentioned how CDC is changing their guidance all the time. And a little while ago, the CDC said, well, you can allow those who've had close contact back to work. And, you'll recall from previous conversations, we talk about close contact as those that have been within 6 feet for 10 or 15 minutes, or who are household partners of somebody who's been diagnosed with COVID-19 disease. The dogma and the initial way we handled that was those close contacts stay out for 14 days because by then, if they're going to get sick, they will have got sick. The CDC came back and said, if you want to bring them back, that's okay. And to be honest with you, we at TAG had just a little bit of a quirky moment about that because that decision wasn't based on new science. And obviously, you bring a close contact back, it could add additional risk. So how do you work this one out? And we've seen things all over the map. Some companies have said, CDC says it's good, bring everybody back. Others have said, nope, we're going to stick with the 14 days. But there is a balance. And what we recommend you do is to go through a 3-step process. Number one, if you've got somebody out who's a close contact, step one, ask yourself, is that person essential to my business? If they're not, leave them out. If they are, ask the second question, which is, if they're essential, what's the level of contact? If they are a household partner of somebody who is positive, they are high risk, leave them out. If they are a 6-foot, barely had a contact with a symptomatic person at work, then the risk of exposure is really quite low, and you may be able to bring them back. But if you do, step 3 is make sure you are following the CDC guidance on protecting the workforce from that person, which means take their temperature before they come to work, mid-shift, masking, hand washing, and very, very comprehensive social distancing. If you do that, you can bring an essential worker back. That's TAG's view of how to do that safely. And I think we've definitely seen evidence that if you don't follow that safe way to bring them back, you can wind up in a bit of a pickle. Next slide, please. Further challenges, obviously, exposures are not just when you sign in for your shift and you have your temperature check and you do your wellness check. And it's like, all right, I've done my 8-hour shift, my 12-hour shift. Now I can go home and have fun. The exposures are a 24/7 kind of thing. You could get exposed on your way home as you go to the grocery store, as you fill up with gas. So maintaining social distancing, maintaining information about carpooling and those sorts of things. And again, we've all heard the stories. And we were talking to somebody earlier this week who said, we had a positive person and they carpool with 13 others in a van. I'm sure some of you have heard that story. And, it's like, well, what about all these people in the carpool? Should we keep them out when we have a positive? No masks. These people were probably within 18 inches of each other. It's like, yeah, of course. So we have to constantly think about exposures outside the workplace. And obviously, food facilities are a hotspot. It's a challenge. A lot of focus, a lot of media focus, a lot of negativity flying around as these facilities reopen. And workers are frightened. They're scared. They're worried. So as we're managing risks, it is obviously public health risk that we're trying to manage, but we have to remember that there's a lot of anxiety, and we have to manage that too. Next slide. So to come back to testing, and talk a little bit about that in the context of testing. What will I do with the data question comes right back up. And if you remember, I said we basically got two kinds of tests. We've got testing for the virus, and we've got serology, looking for the antibody. So if we talk about testing for the virus, a very, very important point is that virus tests tells you what you were at the time you were tested. That's all it tells you. So if you take a nasal swab at 9 o'clock on Monday morning and you get the result on Wednesday evening, it tells you what your virus status was on Monday morning at 9 o'clock. It does not tell you what you are on Wednesday evening when you get the data. Now, could that person have got infected in the 48 hours between the test and the result? Absolutely, of course they could. So if you can reduce it to 24 hours, that's better. Where we see the value of these coming in really big time is at the point at which we can kind of do them at the point of checking in. Now, that means they've got to be available, they've got to be fast, they've got to be accurate, and obviously they've got to be cost effective. If it's going to cost you $100 to test every employee every time they come to work, there's no economics. It makes no sense. So I think this is going to evolve in terms of the way it goes. But the key thing to remember is that when you get the result, it tells you what the status was at the time of the test. Now, I'm stating the obvious. I'm sure you will get it. It's like, yeah, of course. But do keep that in mind. The serology, where you're looking for the antibody response, simply tells you that you've got immunity, you've got antibodies to the coronavirus that's causing COVID-19 disease. We don't know how long that immunity will last. We certainly don't know how protective it is. And if we start to use antibody screening too fast to make business decisions in terms of, yeah, we'll let you back if you're antibody positive, we've got to be very careful we don't create an incentive to be immune. If people who have immunity are perceived as having one up on those that don't, if they feel they're getting privileges because they've got immunity. And you can imagine the way the human psyche could go on this one in terms of, oh, wow, I want to be an innie. I want to be part of the inner circle. I've had the virus. I'm strong. I survived. And we have to think about that almost could create an incentive to become infected. It sounds bizarre, but I think we have to be very thoughtful before we use serology to use it as a business tool or a come back to work tool. I think it's a great tool to tell us what the general level of immunity is in the environment, in our community. But we need to be just cautious, like everything else we do. What will we do with the data and the impact of it? Let's go to the next slide. Misinformation's all over the place. We're fighting fake news. Look at your information sources. Ben's shared some great information. We feel good about it. But there's a ton of stuff flying out there around in terms of, if I stand in front of a UV light for 8 hours a day, is that going to save me from getting the virus? No, it won't, and it'll have other consequences. If I goggle on bleach, will it kill the virus? Well, it probably will, but it'll do a heck of a lot of damage in your throat at the same time. I'm not exactly making that sort of stuff up because you see it out there. We have to be so careful about this and communicating and educating your workforce. They are scared. And that's a really important part of what this is all about in terms of managing this risk. It is a public health risk, but the workforces are anxious, they're nervous, they're worried. They're worried at many levels. And you need to have a plan to be able to keep them informed and react to misinformation. It's just so important. We're not just managing disease, we're managing people's mental well-being as much as anything else. Next slide. Long term, as Ben has said, we're coming back. We're turning the corner in places. We've turned the corner in places. Different regions are going to move at different rates. We're already seeing that. Some states have already announced they're going to be opening up next week. Some are sort of saying, nope, we're staying hunkered down. The serological testing, as I mentioned, the antibody testing could well be helpful as we look at this broadly and a better understanding of the immunity. But we need to be careful Does having antibody to this virus protect you? We don't know that yet. I've often said, you get vaccinated against measles as a kid, and it sees you through pretty much the rest of your life. With influenza, you need to get vaccinated every year. Why? Partly because the immunity doesn't last, and secondly, because the virus changes. So we don't know with this critter, this coronavirus, exactly what's going to happen. And as we look long term, what's the new normal look like? We're beginning to get a bit of sense of that. And I think part of what we'll be discussing on future FSMA Fridays is from a practical perspective is exactly what that new normal really is and how we adjust to it and succeed both in business and in society. And next slide. I think that pretty much takes us into Q&A, Aaron. So I'm going to hand it back to you.
Yeah, thanks, David. Couple of things, and we see your questions. We're going to jump into them, and I appreciate everyone hanging on. We've gone over our 30-minute normal allotment on purpose because we do want to give this subject the time it deserves. Something you said, though, really stood out to me, David and Ben, which was, what do you do with the data? I love that mindset, which is, okay, great, have a plan for it. But, often many of us in our plants are dealing with this, the screening of people and checking on wellness checks and so forth with paper. And that's not ideal for data usage or sharing or trending, it's almost like locking in a vault. And several safety chain customers are actually using our system to do personnel screening, do remote supplier auditing, in fact, and changeover manager. And one in particular is actually reporting these findings to a municipality government, right? When you think of data, I encourage people to think of how can you use the data, not just what to do with it, right? How can you best use the data? So keep that in mind as you are consuming this information and kind of getting used to it. So, all right, so we've got a ton of questions, guys, and I'm gonna just kind of pick off a few of these things to get started. So one of them was basically, if someone gets exposed, how long after should they test for the virus? Is that something you guys can tackle here?
Well, yeah, we can try. I think as we both said, we're learning every day about this, and what we've learned is that when you get infected by the virus, let's call that day zero. You're exposed to it. You've been infected by the virus. The first thing that happens is that virus attaches to one of the cells in your nose or in part of your lungs. And it will begin to grow. It will multiply. So one virus becomes 2, becomes 4. Obviously, in those early days, you're not excreting the virus because there isn't enough of it. It eventually gets to the point where the virus is growing enough and you start to cough it out, or when you speak, it's in some of the moisture that comes out of your mouth or your nose. That's when you become infectious. And we know the average incubation period is about 5 days. 5 to 6 days, average, 50% of people. By 11 days, it's up to probably 97% of people will get sick if they're going to. We also know that some of the highest loads of virus in people are in the 48 hours before they get symptoms. And it ramps up from the point at which you get infected, day zero, it ramps up. So if the average is 5 days, then you'd think on day 3 and day 4, you are increasingly excreting the virus. You feel fine. You're totally unaware. You're oblivious that you've got it, but you are excreting the virus. And that's the best guidance we've got is probably you're at your riskiest of spreading it in those couple days before you get sick, and obviously that first day you're sick, and then progressively we think it goes down in terms of the viral load. Now, the problem there, Aaron, is if you get sick on day 5, you're excreting highly on day 3 and 4. If you get sick on day 8, you're excreting on day 6 and 7. So that's why answering that question is a little challenging. But But the message here is when you are asymptomatic, you can spread the virus, and you control that risk with social distancing, hand washing, not touching your face, and increasingly the use of a mask. If you're infected and you're wearing a mask, it will reduce the likelihood you spread it to others. I think that's pretty clear.
Yeah.
So the rules that I mentioned and that Ben talked about in the pyramid, those apply to everybody, whether you feel sick or not. That's how I sort of see that one.
Yeah. Okay, that's good. Thank you. Yeah, this is a really interesting question from Darla. Thanks for your question. And this actually, in the face of some plant closures, I think is really timely. What agency is dictating plant closures when there are several cases, and what is the threshold they're using for closure? I don't know if there is. I think that these have been self-imposed closures. Can you tackle that? Is there an agency that would say, hey, we see this happening and you need to close?
Ben, do you want to take that one?
Sure, David. Yeah, thanks. Well, I think this speaks to what you were talking about earlier in the presentation, David, in terms of an uneven public health response nationally. And so, it's very much a reflection of where public health capacity is. Aaron, you're right. In some of these instances, these are closures where the company has looked at the level of illness that might be happening in the workforce and made a decision to say, for the time being, it's going to be more effective to close this facility and get a handle of what's going on. And in other instances, it's either the state or even local county health department coming in and making that assessment. And I would say, David, you can chime in as well, but I would say that the threshold or criteria where public health agencies are stepping in really varies across the board. And it's probably a reflection of capacity, it's a reflection of personality. It may not be a true reflection of risk in that facility. I think you can look at a facility like those that have been in the news where you've got 5 or 6 or 700 cases of illness, and that's a clear instance where closing that facility is pragmatic. But in other instances, you might have a handful of cases and there's significant public health pressure to close that facility. And part of that, I think, comes and will come from looking at some of those gating criteria that came out of the White House. So if your food facility represents a significant number of cases in that state or a hotspot, it's conceivable that public health will want to step in and get control of that, because it could be preventing the wider state economy from reopening in some instances, especially in states that don't have as large a population. I think that's what you're seeing in some instances in the Midwest, especially in the meat processing industry. But David, any thoughts to add there?
Those are great points, Ben. A couple of other little things I'd add is that what we're seeing is it is all over the map, but we've said that. I think if the local health department believes that there is community spread going on inside the plant, i.e., it's being passed inside the facility at some level that's significantly, and that's not defined, greater than in the community in general, then they tend to take action. And that's sort of been a little bit of a driver that we've seen. I was talking to somebody just yesterday about, is there a magic percentage? If you've got 3% of the workforce infected, is that going to be closure? And there's nothing out there. And we've seen actions at the state level. We've seen actions at the local level. And what seems to be clear, at least at the federal level, is FSIS is not closing plants, and neither is FDA. They are deferring to the public health officials at state and local level, is what we're observing. So those are the ones. But looking at community spread within the facility, whatever that is, manufacturing or packing or distribution, warehouse, whatever it is, if there's transmission going on in there, then they're more likely to come in and want to take some action.
Yeah. Okay, good. Thanks, guys. That's brilliant. got time for a few more. I do see we have plenty of people still on the line, so if you guys are okay, we'll tackle a couple of more questions. The next one is there a type of mask that is recommended for production areas? And this person, thanks for your question, Lisa, is talking about cold and that ambient temperature and that sort of, is there a particular type of mask that's recommended?
You know, I'll let Ben answer that one in detail, but generally, there's a lot of information out there about the efficacy of different masks, and they vary with the basic mask, and they also hugely vary with how you use it. But that's sort of just a quick 50,000-foot view. Ben, what are your thoughts on specific types of masks?
Yeah, you know, and I think it's important to remember why we're recommending or why CDC is recommending mask usage, you know, in the community and in these kind of environments. And it's essentially to prevent the spread of respiratory droplets from the wearer to others around them. So it's not providing respiratory protection to the wearer like a N95 mask would in a medical setting. So, you know, in those environments, like if you're in a cold setting, a freezer or a cooler, you know, anything that functions as a face covering that can reduce or droplet spread, you know, through breathing or coughing or those kind of activities is going to confer some benefit. And that's where you see, you know, if you go to the CDC's website and talk about, you know, just face coverings in general, those will be certainly more effective than not wearing a mask in terms of reducing droplet spread. And we do know that even, you know, talking can result in droplet spread from person to person. So that's really part of the basis of those recommendations.
Great. Yeah, there's a lot of questions about really some pretty detailed. I can definitely tell, David and Ben, that the questions we're seeing are very detailed. They're really these food facility workers are trying to figure out how to, in a very detailed manner, manage this. One from Krista is, I think, worth just sharing is, you know, if we want to implement testing on site, should we work with our local health department beforehand? Any opinion on that?
It depends on the relationship with the local health department. You know, I think you need to understand what their expectation is of if you find a positive. And some health departments want to know, and some health departments are less fussed. You don't, in my view, you don't need permission from the health department to start to do testing. It's your decision to do it. And as I mentioned in the opening comments, the EEOC basically opened the door for you to do that. I think from both Ben and I, as you know, ex-public health officials working in the government, support the notion of having good relationships with the health department, keep them looped in, don't surprise them, and don't let them surprise you. So I think good communication with the health department is always a wise move all the time. But I don't think my view is you don't actually have to let them know. Ben, what's your feeling?
Yeah, I mean, I think the only caveat to that would be, and I think this hasn't really been fully explored yet because this is such a new concept for sort of employer-based infectious disease testing. You know, we're kind of in this brave new world, if you will. But you know, a condition like COVID-19 in a lot of states will meet the definition of a reportable illness to the state. So I think that's something that, you know, as food companies think about this, you know, work with outside expertise to figure out what obligation you may be under, you know, if you do find somebody that's positive in your workforce, because, you know, as employers may start to take the place of, you know, traditional clinic environments, and for good reason from an employee health and protection standpoint, you know, I think we're going to have to think about what that means from a public health reporting standpoint as well. So it's not a solid answer, but it's a consideration that needs to be part of that calculus.
Yeah, that makes sense. One, earlier in the presentation, David, you hit on something I think that's critically important. You know, we talk about the science, we talk about transmission rates, we talk about testing and all these things, but the psychological wellness is also a big part of this, and we've been certainly in touch with our customer base, and as you have as well. This idea of welfare spaces. The question is, is there any? Do you see a benefit of fogging wellness areas? Is there a benefit, or is it effective? And I just wanted to kind of add a question alongside of that. To frame that. Normally, people go into work and they do their job, and there's these breaks and your lunch or your shift break and all that, and you get to hang out with other people. And when you can't do that because of social distancing, that does have an effect. And so I think that this is important to tackle and to try and say, hey, is there something that we can help our, the FSMA group understand in those welfare areas? Is there a way that we can keep people coming together in places, even if they can still be 6 feet apart, to feel more safe being in those welfare areas, I guess?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the looking after mental wellness and the psychological impact of this is huge, Aaron. We can't underestimate the impact this is having on people. We all feel it when we're at home, and I mean, it's weird, it's different, it's odd. Workers in food industry are stressed because they're having to leave the safe haven of home and go out there and do a really important job, and they are anxious and nervous about it, and their family's anxious and nervous about it. So we have to be supportive of that, the big picture. Ben and I have been exploring technologies that perhaps are in the future, and there are technologies available that seem to have activity against the coronavirus, that are potentially things that one could have in the atmosphere, in the air. It's really, really, really early days yet, but some of the technologies that I'm sure some of the people on the call are familiar with are like hydrogen peroxide, and the whole idea that is a technology that it is used today. It's used on cruise ships, for example, and it seems to be really good at destroying norovirus on food contact on contact surfaces. I shouldn't say food contact on cruise ships. And so, if that technology will kill noro, which is a tough virus, I've got every confidence it's going to nail us an envelope virus like coronavirus. The science isn't there to prove me right, but I think I feel pretty confident making that prediction. The problem we've got is this great stuff for killing virus on surfaces. We do that already with bleach and other things. But what about spread in the air? And, what I would love to see, if I could sort of look at the Holy Grail and say, what would I like to see? Is I'd like to see something that we could have in the atmosphere, in a food plant or a restaurant, an airplane, a cruise ship, that is going to kill virus as it's floating around in the air and reduce person-to-person transmission. Perhaps not completely nail it, but reduce it. And Ben and I are sort of looking at hydrogen peroxide as an exciting molecule. It's safe at low concentrations. You can operate in an environment where it's around, and people do very safely. EPA proved it. Not sure we can get the levels up high enough, but that's ultimately we're going to have to figure that out. Or we're going to be trying to have conversations through face masks, or it's going to drive us apart, and that's going to be pretty destructive in the long term. But Ben, do you have any other thoughts on that one?
No, I think to speak to, I think in terms of definitely want to recognize the key role that the food industry plays right now as part of essential infrastructure, and it's been just really a privilege, I think, for all of us at TAG to work with so many companies that are struggling with this right now, and that's the camaraderie that comes with working in a food processing environment. You really can't underestimate the impact that social distancing has right now in terms of just the regular day-to-day work, but also the additional stress that it brings to be in environments like that. I mean, I think it's important to just thank those that are on the call that are moving food to our grocery stores and to all of us on a daily basis. A lot of it, to me, beyond what David talked about in terms of environmental controls and technology does come back to just, making sure that we do see an increase in some of that testing and public health infrastructure. It's through those tools as well that I think we come back to a space where we have confidence that, those that are out, working in broader society are, potentially not infectious. And so I think that will be key to sort of bringing that confidence back and, allowing people to just come back and work more closely in the way that they're used to.
Yep. Yeah. And I'd echo that, Ben. It is a privilege to be in this marketplace. And I feel very strongly that, the folks that are leaving, like you said, the safe haven of their homes and going in and making sure there's food on my grocery shelf, they're nothing less than heroes in my mind. And again, it is a privilege to work both with our customers and alongside the Acheson Group. So we're going to close it there, but I just wanted to sort of wrap it up. Tons of information. Go out to safetychain.com. I talked about those COVID solutions that our customers are using. Please sign up for the TAG newsletter. First thing after this, you get off this call, go over to the Acheson Group, sign up for their newsletter. It's amazing information. So, Ben and David, again, thank you so much for your time. We'll be at this again, and I know we'll stay very closely in touch through all of this. Thank you again.
Thanks, Aaron.
You're welcome. Pleasure. Thanks for the great questions.
Thanks, all.
Yeah. All right. This concludes the program today, guys. Be safe. Be well. Thank you.